Welcome to Breaking Par with Bernard Sheridan, the golf instruction podcast that helps you take control of your game. Now, here's your host, the founder of Par Breakers Golf Academy and certified Golf Channel Swing Fix instructor, Bernard Sheridan.
Kevin, welcome to Breaking Par. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Bernard. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, the first time that I met you was down at this year's PGA show, and you were giving a lecture down there on, I want to say, ground force and power and verticals and things like that, which we're going to get a little bit later on into this conversation into more depth. But what I wanted you to tell our audience out there in Par Nation is, how did you get involved in golf instruction originally, and what made you decide to take that career path?
Well, I obviously played junior golf, college golf, some mini tour golf, as most of us did, and was probably a little bit too technical for my own good. Felt like I was always, in hindsight, I guess, spending too much time on the range and tweaking this and tweaking that. And so when I used to take lessons from some of David Ledbetter's instructors. So when the opportunity came up, when they had a job opening there, then being a bit conservative by nature on top of a bit technical, I went ahead and took the opportunity to take a job with David Ledbetter.
So sometimes, I guess you were saying that you kind of were always tweaking and working on things. So it really ended up then that where you are, that's really what you're doing with all your students all the time anyway. You're tweaking little things, you're working on things. So it was really probably meant to be that this is what you were supposed to do.
Well, it was funny that you say that, because some of my teammates in college, after the fact, you get together in a reunion or something like that. We always knew you were going to do that. I was spending more time helping them than I was, even tweaking myself sometimes. So as far as they were concerned, that was what I was always going to be doing.
Sure. So we have a little bit of music there in the background.
Yeah, sorry, the phone was ringing. Sorry about that.
That was an interesting ring too. That's good. So a little bit of levity on the show.
No, this is Dwayne. Kevin's on a blog interview blogcast.
I lost the sound, Bernard.
Did you lose the sound?
All
right.
I'm good now.
Are you good?
I'm good.
Okay.
Certainly.
All right. So we're hearing some talking in the background. Oh, that's your voicemail probably that was picking up. So essentially, you're working with a lot of juniors, correct?
That is correct. At the moment, I'm at the International Junior Golf Academy here in Hilton Head, South Carolina.
Nice. So give us a little bit of insight of some of the things that you're normally working on with these players.
Yeah, so obviously, as we all know, it depends based on someone's need and whether they need some technical work or some work on the golf course. But, I've always felt like that, being a bit more technically minded has been good for me, because I know from my mistakes how to encourage these kids to be better on the golf course. I've used that to not be too technical with them. But at the same time, my mind is the way my mind is, right? So we've always felt like we use technology here. We've got a TrackMan and Dr. Rob Neal's golf biodynamic system, etc., in a way to prescribe the best diagnosis, the fastest diagnosis, to not be too technical, but to get to the nitty-gritty faster so we can spend more time on the golf course helping kids, the students, improve their scores, which obviously that's what everyone wants to do. They want to shoot lower scores.
Sure, absolutely. And I know that myself, too, I don't get over technical with a lot of the equipment that I use, but I do try to use it to do exactly that, to get to the root of the problem more quickly, so that I understand exactly what's happening, and then try to translate that into either a feeling for the player or for a position that they might want to need to hit or something like that they feel comfortable with, but I usually try to translate everything to feelings, because I think a lot of players are feel-oriented. How do you find it? Do you think that more players are feel, or do you think that they're visual or their position? What do you run across the most of the time?
I probably never thought about what I run across most of the time, but in thinking about it, I would probably say more field oriented. So to me, you've got the science and you've got the art, and the best teachers have the instincts on when to be a scientist, so to speak. Probably degrading science, the real scientists out there. Sorry about that, but
Sure.
when to be a scientist, so to speak, and when to be an artist. So,
Right, or in other words, when to play that role, when to put on that hat to do science and or just art. In other words, the feel side of the game and shot shaping and things of that nature.
right, exactly. And I think the science side is more for the coach, right? It's not necessarily for the student, so to speak.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that. I think that sometimes the science side, you have students who are interested in that, which is kind of like yourself when you were younger. That interests you. So I do have a few students here and there who like to look at those numbers because they understand them, and that's just the way they think. But they're few and far between.
I would agree. Yeah, I mean, you take a guy like a Charles Howell, who's, you know, he's a little bit more technically minded, and sometimes he knows a lot of the numbers and wants to know the numbers. And you take a guy like a Camilo Villegas that uses TrackMan quite a bit. He has his own TrackMan, but has one or two numbers that he looks at, and if those numbers are in order, he focuses on using it for his distances, etc. But like you said, um, probably few and far between. The guys like Charles know it, kind of need to know it, but then there's a delicate balance of how much they need to know, right? So they need to know it to kind of satiate their need for it, but then need to make sure that they use it in a proper way to help them play better and shoot for lower scores.
Now, across the board, since you're working with a lot of up and coming elite players, do you find that with some of those that you're trying to show them those numbers, do you ever really get into that with them, or do you try to avoid that as much as possible?
I try to avoid it as much as possible because some of the ones that want to know the numbers, that's the balance too. Okay, so you take a guy like a Charles that wants to know the numbers. Does he need to know the numbers? Does he really need to, even though he thinks he needs to? Not talking about Charles himself, but the more technically minded. But certainly these days, if you know that someone's pelvis is swaying too far to the right using 3D, or away from the target in the backswing, where on video it might not look as such, or that their attack angle on a TrackMan or a flight scope is steeper than what it appears on video. I mean, you can certainly shortcut the learning process if that person needs to hit more down or more up instead of just guessing by looking at a video.
Sure, and I know that for me, when I get involved with that with some players, I might say, look, we have this many degrees of hip rotation right now, and we'd like to try to tighten that up. We're over rotating our hips a little bit on the backswing. So let's see what you can try to do to make that a little bit more tight. And then they'll do that, and then we'll look at the number again, and I'll say, okay, this is how much that feeling gave you. So you might want to try to continue to have that feeling because this is more the result that we'd like to see.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head because you didn't tell them, okay, you've got 49 and we need 41, or you've got
Right.
60 and you need, you just said, hey, you've got a little bit too much hip turn. So you use that science or the 3D or the TrackMan or whatever, you used it, but then related it to the student in a way that wasn't so monotonous to them or too much information. So it's like, oh, you've got too much hip turn. Let's see if you can get a little bit less, and then you can show them. You can quantify it later.
Right, exactly. So I find that for that, the technology side is a great way for us to show them improvement, and so that they can see that improvement in technology. In other words, they're like you said, you're quantifying it for them. So that makes a huge difference in, I want to say, the validation of what was happening. That we can validate it now that it actually was a change as opposed to what we just see. I know that when we just see stuff, or we use, let's say, unless we're using high-speed camera, but a lot of times as instructors, if we're not using a high-speed camera, we're just out on the range and we're not constantly videotaping stuff and looking at it, our eyes only see it 15 frames a second. So there's some things that we can miss, and we can't always see the difference. But if we have this type of technology, it's a way for us to measure it much more easily.
Certainly. And then, for your example of the hip rotation and the backswing, once that person gets less and they've hit, X amount of balls at a certain target with X amount of hip rotation and it's much better, then you can certainly randomize the practice a little bit, change clubs, hit the different targets and see if they can maintain it. Because then that gets a little bit more into the playing mode. And if they can't maintain it, then they go back to, a bit of block practice. Block and random practice are kind of the buzzwords these days. So you can kind of vary it a little bit, so it's not just hitting 400 7-irons at a target, because we all know that's not playing golf. No. But at the same time, if they can't do it with one club, they're probably not going to do it with them all. So I like to do it in a bit of a block format and then to kind of randomize it a little bit. If they're visually, you can start to see it once you know what the difference looks like, right? So if you start randomizing a little bit and they don't maintain it, then you go back and then you just keep going back and forth, and that helps them get it to where it's a little bit more golf course environment as best you can.
Sure, absolutely. I always try to make that transition as seamless as possible, and I always have my players always working on with a lot of different clubs, because I know that most amateurs get tied up into maybe 2 or 3 clubs when they practice. They might hit a wedge, a 7-iron, and a driver. So now when they're out on the range, that's really all they're hitting. And then when they go out on the golf course, they have these other shots with clubs that they're not really working with. So I try to get them to switch it up all the time, or maybe even to play in their head like a round of golf on the range, so that at least they can be picking targets and make that a little bit more seamless transition.
Right. There's a big story from, the year Nick Faldo won the Masters when Greg Norman was leading it. I guess he was hitting it so bad on the range before the week started that David Ledbetter had him just play the golf course on the range. And, I think Nick was probably a lot more of a field player than people gave him credit for, just because they saw him doing drills and stuff. But he had the ability to kind of turn it off when he needed to. But nevertheless, he was just hitting it pretty bad, I guess, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And so at the end of Wednesday, David had him play the golf course on the range, so to speak, pick different targets, all right, number one's a driver, maybe 9-iron back in the day before they lengthened it. So he hit a driver, in the direction that the hole would be, and then kind of a 9-iron as best they could on the range. And I think he did that every day, and obviously he played quite well. He ended up winning.
Yeah, it's amazing, too, how... And it's great that you just brought up that story, and that's a great way for amateur players and even professional players alike to think that, golf is a fickle game, and sometimes you could be hitting the ball terrible, but that doesn't mean that you want to give up on yourself. You want to keep doing like exactly what Nick did and just keep going after what you want to do or trying to create in your game. And next thing you know, it can come right back and turn around. And as long as you stick to your game and play your game, the other player who might be 6, 7 shots ahead of you, you never know what they're going to do. You can't control them. They might continue to hold that lead, or they might collapse, like what happened with Greg Norman. And then you end up at the end, you're the guy holding the prize. And in the beginning of the week, you never even dreamt of that because you were hitting the ball terrible. So that's an awesome story. I mean, it's really when you think about it, it gives players hope.
Yeah, and I think that's the making of a true champion. What have you got when you don't have your best stuff? Can you get it done? We can all play to our handicap or play better than our handicap when it's 75 degrees and sunny with no wind. But the makings of a true champion are what have you got inside when the chips are down, so to speak. Can you gut it out, and do you have the heart to try to do the best you can and grind out a score?
Exactly. Now I'd like to get into the information that you covered down there at the PGA show next, and I think that there's so many players out there who really want to get more power, or find out how they can create more distance. And I know that a lot of what you covered talked a lot about how that happens, and really how many players have the same type of things happen at the same time to create the most amount of power and speed in their swing. So can you get a little bit into depth with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm certainly no biomechanist, and as one of my colleagues always says, he's only the smartest guy in the room, and he's the only guy in the room. But I kind of, piece some stuff together over time. I've had the opportunity to be involved with some force plates and 3D, and obviously high-speed video. So I had some of the students here down in Orlando at the Golf Week tournament. It's a pretty good tournament, and so I snuck them into the Ledbetter Academy there and had them using some force plates and showed how much pressure they were pushing into the ground with right foot leaf. Didn't measure shear force, but measured, normal force or ground force. And one of the kids, weighs 160 something pounds, and under his left foot was, when his left arm was parallel to the ground, and his downswing was like 25 pounds. And then there was a kid that weighed 130 pounds, and his was 180. And so through, obviously being involved in that, obviously the kid that's pushing into the ground with 180 pounds has more than 100% of his body weight is going to hit it a lot farther than the other guy, assuming he hits it in the middle of the face, etc. So I'd called another colleague of mine named Nate Doherty that helps us with the golf biodynamics system. And it just dawned on me. I was driving down the road in Hilton Head, and I said, can you pull up this kid Tenishan? I said, can you pull up Tenishan's lift graph? So the lift graph, obviously, is how much up and down the pelvis is moving. Not necessarily forward and back, but lift is only up and down. So he said, okay, it's pretty flat. There's not much down or up. I said, okay, can you pull up this guy Shisa? And he's like, there's probably 4 or 5 inches, from address to the most it went down was probably 2.5 inches, and then it got 2.5 inches above where it started. So basically a 5-inch range. And so then we got into the timing of it. So as soon as I got to the academy, we pulled up the force plate numbers. I took all the pictures from Champions Gate and pulled up the lift graphs, and there was a definite correlation between the longer hitters, the amount that the pelvis went down, and the amount that the pelvis went up. And again, we based that on the force plate data and the lift graph. So I had that data on both of those players. So then it was kind of like, well, can we look at this on 2D, and does it correlate closely? So maybe some of us that don't have access to all of this stuff can actually get something out of it. And obviously, you're never going to see in 2D what you can see in 3D. Obviously,
Sure.
Especially with swing planes and, wrist positions of flexion, extension, radial and ulnar deviation, all that stuff. But, looking at it from just face on and putting a dot or a line on the pelvis, does this work? So we did it, and we found out that, number one, it's pretty accurate. When we looked at the pressure, the 3D and the 2D, it was pretty darn close, much, much closer than we expected. So, and then we started looking at the timing of it. And the best players, like your / longest hitters, a Dustin Johnson, a Rory, basically their pelvis has reached the lowest point in the lift graph, if you can imagine a graph. So the pelvis here's where it starts. It goes down as you start to make your transition, and then as you start pushing into the ground, it goes up, if that makes sense. So if you put a dot on their pelvis at address, it'll go a little bit more down, and by the time their left arm's parallel to the ground in their downswing is at the lowest point. So from that position, when the left arm's parallel to the ground in the downswing, the pelvis actually starts to rise from that position. And that's exactly what we saw with the pressure, and that's exactly what we saw with the 3D. Like I said, to combine those three, it was really about as accurate as we could have expected or we could have wanted. So going back to the pressure, that's the exact same time when the left arm's parallel to the ground is when the maximum amount of pressure is for most of the players. Somewhere between left arm parallel to the ground and club. So it was pretty accurate. So obviously, as they're starting their downswing, they start to unweigh a little bit as they kind of squat down, and then when the left arm's parallel to the ground is at the lowest point is the same time they're putting max pressure, if that makes sense. Because as they reach the lowest point, they're really starting to push into the ground to get the pelvis to shoot up in the air. So it was pretty interesting, the correlation between the two. And like I said, the thing for me was, it's never going to be as accurate as if you had 3D or force plates, but it's pretty close for those of us that just don't have the access to it, for someone that needs to hit it farther.
Sure. So there's a lot of instructors who, unfortunately, they don't have the access to all this technology, due to maybe financial reasons or just for the fact that, a lot of the players that they're working with, um, they feel like they don't need that much information for those players if they're working for real high handicap players, things like that.
Sure.
But a good way, like, and so to explain this to our listeners, because I understand exactly what you're saying, and of course I was fortunate enough to be able to see you speak, and that's a big reason why I have you on the show, because I was very impressed by what your findings were, and it made a tremendous amount of sense to me. It kind of brought a lot of things into my mind as to what I can get players to get a little bit more pop out of the ball. But so when we're talking about 2D, we're talking about just straight video. We look at it face on. We might draw a line across the player's belt line at address, and now we can see that belt line move below that line and move above that line, depending upon where the player is in the swing.
Absolutely.
So that for amateur players out there, they could who maybe are trying to get a little bit more power on their own, they could set up a camera, videotape themselves face on, take a pencil or something if they don't have a draw. Well, I mean, there's so many different apps out there that you can purchase for $5. That V1, Coach's Eye, they're all kinds of them, that they can use to draw that line right across their waistline or right at their belt line, and then throughout their swing, let's see where that belt line moves. And so what we want to see is we want to see it dropping a little bit on the backswing, and then we want to see it starting to rise as soon as their left arm becomes parallel to the ground. Correct?
Correct. So you take someone like a Yanni Singh who really uses the ground. Obviously, she hits it really far. She tends to drop a little bit more in the backswing than others, where some of them might stay fairly level in the backswing, and as they get to the top, it starts to go down a little bit, and then when their left arm gets parallel to the ground, it shoots up in the air, and the most do it obviously the fastest. So the slope on the graph would be actually the steepest. So they do it in a short amount of time, and I think a lot of that stuff you can actually kind of train in the gym. With some box jumps or
Sure.
some plyometric work, stuff like that. It's obviously somewhat hard to do the timing of it. A guy like a Dustin Johnson, I would guess doesn't. I've never talked to him, but I would guess that he doesn't know that he does it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the best players who just absolutely annihilate the ball, like you just said, like Dustin, I think it's something that's just what he does.
It's an athletic movement.
Absolutely, I don't think he thinks about it at all. But I think that if you're a type of player who doesn't do it or doesn't have any kind of distance, then that might be something that you might want to work on. Of course, as you just said, timing issues come in tremendously, especially if there's too much of a lowering of the pelvis on the backswing. Sometimes that can get out of sync with the player's arms, and now things are getting a little funky, and they're topping the ball or they're doing whatever. So
right. So there's obviously a lot of instructors out there, and this knowledge is traveling around quite a bit. Not that I invented anything, certainly. I just happened to put a couple things together. But, I'm certainly not the first person in the world that's ever talked about ground reaction force. So, I would recommend if you were a higher handicapper and at home doing it, you would actually do it with the help of your teaching professional.
Oh, I totally agree
obviously
with that.
There's a lot of timing issues, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of stuff you can actually kind of do in the gym. I think the Dustin Johnsons and the Bubba Watsons are probably at that age where, we were still pulling roots out of the ground and throwing stuff over our heads. And, I think a dilemma and some of the things that I try to educate some of the kids these days is, instead of playing video games, go out in the yard and jump around and twist and spin and flip. And, those are kind of, reactions that you understand. You understand how to use the ground when you do that. If you're jumping and twisting, if you jump and do like a 180, it's a pretty good drill because you're actually using normal force and shear force. I have to give Chris Comer some credit for that one. But that's stuff we always did. As some of us older people,
Yeah.
with some gray hair, that's
Yep.
that we just did that when we were outside. We didn't know that we were doing it, and I would assume that a Dustin Johnson was kind of like that. He's probably a good athlete in everything he does. He was jumping and twisting and skipping and stuff like that.
Well, that's true. That the guys and gals who are older now, or considered older, that's more of what we did just as play. I mean, we were outside. We were doing things. I know that for me, I was involved in every sport under the sun.
Myself as well.
Yeah, I mean, baseball, hockey, football, soccer, lacrosse, tennis, golf. I mean, everything that I could get my hands on. Ice skating, ice hockey, because I'm up here in the Northeast Corridor. So I mean, and all those things. It's just like all we cared about was playing sports and being outside. Um, there was also for that generation a lot of things that just really weren't happening like they are today for kids. In other words, I think there was like two or three shows on TV. Like I think it was like the Flintstones and the Jetsons or something like that.
Right, exactly.
And Gilligan's Island. There wasn't a lot for us to watch. The Three Stooges, things like that. So we didn't do a lot of television watching. We did, and our parents would usually kick us out and say, "Go outside and play."
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, what are you doing in the house? It's a beautiful day. Get out of here. So whereas with kids today, I think it's just the setup of a lot of parents are both working, kids are at home, and and their parents don't want them running around the neighborhood. It might be a little dangerous for them. So then they're playing games and things like that, video games and that type of thing.
Yeah,
Plus
we're in the YouTube age, so the problem
Yeah.
is that some of the kids sit inside and they watch swings on YouTube all the time, and they think that my club needs to be here and my club face needs to be here, and certainly as coaches we have preferences, but that goes a little bit of a different direction with patterns that work. But my point is, we're in the YouTube age, going back to not playing outside and sitting inside. Kids don't work on tempo, and they don't work on using the ground because you can't see that, right? You can only work on what you see and what you think is important. So I think we lose a little bit of the athleticism, and we make these pretty looking swings that sometimes aren't as functional as they need to be.
Sure. So, and we do see then with the bulk of players, and a great example I think is Bubba Watson, of the guys who really hammer the heck out of the ball. There's a tremendous amount of pelvic lift, or what we're going to say a vertical motion of the pelvis. Once that left arm reaches parallel to the ground up to a finish, he almost looks like he's on his toes when he hits the ball.
For sure. And you can get that motion without being on your toes. You can keep your feet on the ground and still get that motion. But I mean, I've never seen a person competing in a long drive competition whose feet are on the ground. I mean, they're obviously maximizing that. So they're obviously not worried about accuracy as much as hitting one ball into the grid. But obviously they're maximizing the vertical force and the horizontal forces as well. But certainly it's really hard to see in 2D. I would think it would be impossible. But, you can see the vertical with the belt buckle, and certainly they're maximizing that stuff. I think the fastest I've seen is on 3D is a kid. He was 25 years old. Anyone younger than me, I call a kid these days. But I think he moved his pelvis 5 inches in 1500ths of a second. So there was certainly some explosiveness in there, and he hit it pretty far. And with all the talk about angle of attack and driver these days, and again, there's patterns that people need to work on and some don't. But I think to hit it long, sometimes it's better to hit up on a driver. So if you can maximize that pelvic motion earlier, with the timing being proper, obviously, but the earlier you can do that, when your left arm's parallel to the ground, obviously as your pelvis starts moving up, then your hands will start moving up earlier. So that club will start moving up earlier. And so not only do you get more speed, you can maximize your ball speed as well, your spin loft, so to speak, using a TrackMan term. So you can actually get less spin as well. So it's kind of a double whammy sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So for players who are interested in having the opportunity to either contact you, work with you directly, Or at this time, are you taking on new students? Or I know that some instructors at certain points they're not taking on new students because their book is full, but they're willing to at least answer questions and talk to people when they get in touch with them. So
Sure, I would be happy to do that. Typically during the week I'm involved with the juniors. Occasionally I'll give a lesson after work if need be, or on the weekend. So Kevin.Smeltz at juniorsports, JUNIOR sports.com is my email. So if anyone has any questions, that would be great if they contact me. I'd be happy to answer.
And what's your website, Kev?
IJGA.com.
I'm sorry, repeat that once more because it broke up.
Okay, IJGA.com for International Junior Golf Academy is the spelled out. So if you go to www.ijga.com,
Great.
you can find out some more information.
Awesome. Well, look, thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule. It was an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. There's some great information there that our folks out there in Par Nation can take away to become better players and to hit the ball as far as they possibly can. So thanks for all your time. And what we always say here in parting is try to keep in the short grass.
Exactly. No problem. Thanks for having me, and hopefully some of the viewers got some great information.
I'm sure they did. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thank you.
Alrighty.
Do you want to play better golf? Of course you do. Well, here are 3 easy ways to do it. 1. Open your smartphone and look for the podcast app. 2. Open the podcast app and search Breaking Par with Bernard Sheridan. 3. Subscribe and never miss an episode of great golf instructor interviews from around the world. A new guest every week, like David Ledbetter, Brian Manzella, Dr. Sashow McKenzie, James Siekman, just to name a few. Hear their insight as they deliver their wisdom of the game. Take control of your game. Subscribe today. Your game will thank you for it.